Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for all of you for coming again. So I got to thinking, we've been talking, although very briefly, about some difficult Buddhist topics off and on in this program. And of course, the whole point of this is to become enlightened, to ultimately become a Buddha ourselves. Because our true nature, we say, the truth of who we are is no different from that of a perfectly enlightened Buddha. But then I've noticed that we don't often talk at Buddhist centers about exactly what a Buddha is. It's just sort of assumed that people know. So I thought that's what we would discuss today. Just very briefly, what is a Buddha? I didn't put it down here, but then because I was thinking before the program today, maybe we should start by talking about what a Buddha isn't. Well, first of all, the Buddha is not a god. Oftentimes people think that Buddha is just the replacement for God in Buddhism. Buddha is not a god. In fact, I remember there's a Buddhist magazine called Tricycle. Are any of you familiar with it? It's an English language, American Buddhist magazine called Tricycle. Tri for the three jewels, I think. Maybe that's why they call it that. And they used to do this part where they would ask a question to just normal everyday Buddhists. And they asked once to children, I think the question was, what is Buddha? And there was a little Chinese American boy who said, Buddha is a Chinese god. Very sweet answer, but technically not correct. So Buddha is not a god. Buddha did not create the universe. He did not create the world. Buddha does not create us. We experience this world and this universe because we have together the similar karma, the same karma, to experience this kind of existence. So in a sense, we create this world and this universe. We continue to create it. As long as there are beings who have the karma to experience a world and universe like this, it will continue. And then what happens is, we've talked about this a little before maybe in weeks past or semesters past, but then ultimately what happens is the universe comes to an end, but there are beings who still have karma to experience some kind of reality like this, and so a new universe arises, fueled by the karma, the leftover karma from beings from the previous universe, and new worlds arise. So Buddha is not a creator being. Buddha is in fact, he started off as a being just like us. But then, there are two different views of this. One is that the Buddha was always enlightened, and that when Shakyamuni Buddha came to this planet 2,600-ish years ago, he only displayed himself as an unenlightened being who went out and meditated and became enlightened in human form because he was already enlightened. That's one view. In fact, that comes from the Lotus Sutra, the sutra that we were talking about last week. Chapter 16, actually, of the Lotus Sutra is all about that. But then there's this other view of the Buddha where he was, in fact, very much a being just like us. And he followed the path. He was an ignorant being who suffered just like us, and over countless lifetimes he became a bodhisattva, and ultimately he became a fully enlightened Buddha. There was a Tibetan Lama once who was asked, well, which is true? And he said, which one inspires you more? Which one gives you more faith? Which view gives you more faith and inspires you to practice? That's the view that you should hold. So I wouldn't worry about which one is literally correct. Just whichever one inspires you to practice more. So then, what is a Buddha? So this is where we begin with the sheet here. One who sees the truth of impermanence and interdependence. So we've talked about this before. Things are made up of parts. They come together. We come together. Physical things come together. Situations come together. They're made up of parts, and they come together because of various causes and conditions. And in fact, there's no point, we take this a step further and we talk about emptiness. There's no point at which things are fixed and unchanging. They're constantly changing in every moment. Our minds are constantly changing. The physical world around us is constantly changing. The situation in which we find ourselves is constantly changing with every moment. Okay, so this is wisdom. So a Buddha perfectly understands this. Now, I have a very general intellectual understanding of this, but I don't actually live in the world this way. I get attached to things and I want to hold on to them just like everyone else. In fact, on Facebook, I put a note up last night. I was just in a good mood and I said, I'm feeling good. That was my status update. And then a whole bunch of my Buddhist friends said, wait for impermanence, it's not going to last. So then I wrote this, I saw that this morning and I wrote, are you sure it won't last forever and ever this time? No, of course not. So, I still cling and grasp at things and try to hold on to them and extract as much happiness from them as possible. But I have an intellectual understanding of this. Buddhas, on the other hand, they have perfect wisdom. Buddhas have absolutely no ignorance, no attachment, no aversion. They don't suffer. And then there are also beings who have perfected compassion. So it's these two things that go together, wisdom and compassion. Those of you who have been coming to the class have heard me talk about this before. Wisdom and compassion are really two sides of the same coin. You can't really have one without the other. You can have actually some insight into impermanence and interdependence, some real insight, maybe without a whole lot of compassion. But really to become a Buddha, to have perfected wisdom, you have to have compassion as well. Because for the most part, wisdom without compassion, I always think of it as the skillful ability to selfishly take care of my own needs, right? We might call it, street smarts or something like that, cleverness. That's not really wisdom. Compassion, on the other hand, we can have compassion without wisdom, but we won't know how to apply it. And the example that I like to give is the parent of a drug or alcohol-addicted child who continues to enable their behavior, cleaning up their messes, right? Giving them money, knowing that they're just going to go out and buy more drugs and alcohol. They do that because they love their child and they want to help them and they don't want to see them suffer, but there's not a lot of wisdom there. And that's not to blame. I want to make sure that I'm clear. I'm not blaming parents of children with these kinds of problems. This isn't blaming them, but it's enabling behavior. Okay, so wisdom and compassion goes together. So wisdom and compassion together, we talk about bodhicitta. Bodhicitta. Notice this is spelled just a C. There's no CH. This is how we spell it in English, but we pronounce it bodhicitta. Okay. So we define bodhicitta. I'm sorry, actually, Nyapakwak, what is the word for bodhicitta in Vietnamese? Bodhetam. Oh, okay. I can read. Bodhetam. Bodhetam. Yeah.
Bodhi là bồ đề là giác ngộ. Chitta là tâm tức là tâm giác ngộ. Bồ đề là giác ngộ.
We'll have a.
Tâm là cái tâm. Chitta là tâm.
Okay, thank you very much. So we define bodhicitta usually as the altruistic mind that wishes enlightenment for all sentient beings. So on the surface, this appears to only apply to compassion. I used to be really confused about this. It seems like the definition is incomplete because bodhicitta is ultimately wisdom and compassion together. So I asked this. When I was studying in Nepal, I asked this question of a professor monk, a Kempo. And he said, well, so as unenlightened beings, we make this aspiration to become someone who has this perfect compassion, this altruistic mind that genuinely wishes the enlightenment of all sentient beings, or for enlightenment for all sentient beings. So when we become fully enlightened Buddhas, we are not, that is, beings who have perfect compassion and wisdom, we are not separate from our previous aspirations, the previous wishes that we made. And so this wish, or this mind that wishes for enlightenment for all sentient beings, that is the end of suffering for all sentient beings, this definition sort of blankets or envelops, it surrounds both compassion and wisdom. So this is the root. This is where we begin. As unenlightened beings, we begin with wishing that other beings, all beings, become enlightened. Even if we don't actually have great compassion and can't carry that out, we begin with that wish. And then that wish grows. It's like the seed that grows into perfect compassion and wisdom. Okay? So that's why we define it that way. And then we talk about relative bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. So relative bodhicitta is this mind wishing compassion for others. It's also, it is the relative bodhicitta is the bodhicitta that we are trying to cultivate now. That's what we're working on as Buddhist practitioners. And then as we grow in our practice and become bodhisattvas, then we start to develop ultimate bodhicitta. And ultimate bodhicitta is this first line. It's one who sees the truth, or seeing the truth of impermanence and interdependence, really seeing it, and emptiness, taking that to its logical conclusion, like I explained a moment ago. So that is ultimate bodhicitta. Actually, ultimate bodhicitta is not just wisdom, it's, again, the union of wisdom and compassion. Okay. So this is what a Buddha has. The Buddha has perfect wisdom and perfect compassion. We also talk about Buddhas as beings who are completely purified. So they have, because they have no ignorance, they have no attachment and no aversion. And it's from that attachment and aversion that what we call the afflictive emotions like anger and hatred and jealousy and so on arise. So when I don't get what I want, or it's taken from me, or I lose it for some reason, or I'm forced to experience what I don't like, that's when I get angry. Or when I see, or depressed maybe, or when I see someone that I don't like getting what they want, when I see my enemy having a good time, that's when I feel jealousy. Maybe sometimes we feel jealous of our friends too. Hopefully we feel happy for them when good things happen to them. So we can see how then from ignorance comes attachment and aversion, and from that comes the afflictive emotions. Buddhas, having no ignorance, they have no afflictive emotions. And as I said, they have no attachment or aversion. And they're also creating no new karma. They act, but they're not creating any new karma. They're purified of all of that. They are outside of the law of cause and effect, really. And then we talk about they are also beings who work for the salvation of all beings. So Buddhas then, Buddhas have no personal volition. A Buddha never thinks, well, I could go here, I could go there. What do I want to do? Maybe today oh wait, the ice cream truck. I'll go run and get ice cream. Forget about these sentient beings. I want some ice cream. Buddha doesn't take a nap. And he doesn't go on vacation. No enlightened being does that. Buddhas are constantly reaching out to beings, trying to lead them along the way. The same thing with the bodhisattvas. The bodhisattvas are like the Buddha's helpers, his assistant teachers. We can think of them like that. So they're constantly reaching out to us, constantly trying to show us the way. As sentient beings, though, as ignorant sentient beings, we don't necessarily have the karma, the good karma, to be able to see that or experience that clearly. Someone asked, maybe last fall or the summer before, sometimes I really feel alone. What do I do about this feeling of being alone? And I said, you said you feel alone, but you're not actually alone, because the enlightened beings are constantly reaching out to us. And in fact, we have people all around us. So if we feel alone, it's in our own heads. We feel alone, but we're actually not. So they're constantly reaching out to us. So Buddhas then see, there are all these suffering sentient beings. But right now, I know that I can do this to help that sentient being or this group of people. I'm actually able to reach them. And so he goes. He just goes. This is what enlightened beings do. They never get exhausted. They never get burned out. Like I said, they never go on vacation. They're just constantly reaching out to us. So this is what a Buddha is, and this is what a Buddha does. What is that line from Forrest Gump? Stupid is as stupid does. Same thing, Buddha is as Buddha does. So you know someone's a Buddha when they have perfect wisdom and compassion. They have no more afflictive emotions, no more karma. And all they do 24/7 is reach out to help other beings without ever getting burned out or exhausted or upset or anything themselves. That's a Buddha. So I will stop there, and we'll see if anyone has any questions. Yes?
Can you give example for relative bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta?
I'm sorry?
Example.
An example?
Relative bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta.
I'm not sure if I can give you a concrete example. The difference is that relative bodhicitta is the compassion and wisdom that we as unenlightened beings are trying to cultivate now. This is what we cultivate when we're on the path. When we are saying prayers, I wish all sentient beings will be enlightened and so on, looking at this. That's what we're cultivating as unenlightened beings. But when we become enlightened, Buddhas have ultimate bodhicitta. This perfection of wisdom and compassion. They're no longer trying to change their own minds. They have it perfectly. Does that make sense? Usually we associate ultimate bodhicitta more with wisdom, but it's really the union of wisdom and compassion. Yeah.
Because sometimes the definition about bodhicitta, they have relative, that means sometimes they said conventional bodhicitta.
Yes.
So the conventional bodhicitta, that's the thing the bodhisattva do, we can see and feel. Mm-hmm. That's altruistic mind that wish all sentient beings to be enlightenment. Mm-hmm. But ultimate, that means maybe the absolute, but they don't use the absolute, the ultimate. Mm-hmm. That's mostly, see emptiness or see the truth of the universe or something.
Right. So Nyapa Kwak actually mentioned another way we translate relative bodhicitta is conventional bodhicitta. You'll see that phrase also in Buddhist writing. So that is the bodhicitta that we are cultivating as unenlightened beings. The easiest way to think of it is that is the bodhicitta that we are cultivating as unenlightened beings. Ultimate bodhicitta is what we have as enlightened beings. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
What's the definition of the nirvana?
Oh. That is a very, very, very difficult question. I'll tell you what. I will research that so I can give a more exact answer, and that is what I will talk about next week. Okay? There's something I could say about it, but I want to give as clear a definition as possible.
So can I ask a second question?
Yes.
Do you know anybody that in current period in the 20th century that is really bodhisattva?
Well, I think I do, but at the same time, it's a subjective state of being. Somebody once said, an enlightened being is someone who can convince enough people that they're enlightened. There's no way, I can't look in somebody's mind and really know, because I'm not an enlightened being. I don't have clairvoyance, right? I can't see into your mind and see what's actually going on in there. So I can't say for sure. Yeah. So I would say that there are people that I have met that seem as close to a bodhisattva as I've ever met. Now, you asked me of people who are alive today. Right, okay. So, yes.
In the century, in the 20th century.
20th century, 21st century, yeah.
21st century.
I would say that there are some that I have met that it wouldn't surprise me if they were bodhisattvas. In fact, this is interesting. Just last semester in one of my classes, there was a Catholic monk interestingly, that we were talking about, he was in like Indonesia or Malaysia or something, and he learned from some Hindus how to do meditation, how to like concentrate his mind, and then sort of coupled with his own prayers and things. He became someone very special. I won't necessarily use the word bodhisattva, but he was at some conference with Buddhists, and I want to say maybe the Dalai Lama was there too, and they were up on a stage. It was like some sort of interfaith gathering, and there was this really bright light that was sort of blinding people from the audience, coming from the direction of this particular Catholic monk. And I wish I could remember his name. But someone in the audience raised their hand and said, "Can you please turn down the lights? This is really blinding me." And then someone said, "There are no lights behind them on the stage." The implication being that the light was coming from this monk. So, and apparently there were a lot of people there who wrote about this. And I've heard other stories like that, interesting stories. I heard a story, I think that one might be a private story, so I won't tell it. But I've heard some other stories of people having interesting experiences like that.
So the Bodhisattva don't have to be Buddhist.
Yeah, this is another interesting question. We discussed this as well when I was studying in Nepal. Was Jesus a bodhisattva, for example? And some people would say absolutely. The Kempo, the Professor Lama who was talking about this, said, well, he said, we don't know, because as far as any record we have, Jesus never identified himself that way. And a bodhisattva would have to know that they were a bodhisattva. You can't be a bodhisattva, and not know it. So if he defined himself in that way, if we were to find some writing that, where Jesus said himself or wrote in his own hand or something, that, that he defined himself in that way, then we could say definitively yes. But I would say it's possible, at least the idea that we have of Jesus today, it's possible to think of him in a bodhisattva-like way. I've actually heard of Buddhist monks in the Tibetan tradition praying to Jesus Bodhisattva because that's how they see him. So I guess it just depends on your view. But then, of course, like I was alluding to a moment ago, we don't really know who Jesus was and what he was like. Yeah. Yes.
Just on the topic of Bodhisattva, I'm still a little hazy about what the distinction between a Buddha and a Bodhisattva was. I always thought that like a Bodhisattva was basically you're going to graduate to Buddhahood, but you have so much compassion that you want to get reborn over and over again to help sentient being.
Mm-hmm.
And then I heard the other thing you said was like they're like Buddha as an assistant. So I'm sort of confused as to what the actual distinction is. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, usually we clarify bodhisattvas in the way that you first mentioned. The difference between a Buddha and bodhisattva is that a bodhisattva says, well, I will remain in the world. But it gets a little fuzzy, though. There are 10 bhumis, 10 levels of bodhisattvahood. Okay, this is an idea that arose later in Buddhism. So there are these 10 levels, and some people say that the 10th level bodhisattva is exactly the same as a Buddha. So this is where it gets confusing. Okay, well, why do we call them bodhisattvas then? If they're the same as Buddhas, then why do we call them bodhisattvas? And I think it's because they're more outwardly active. And then there are some of the bodhisattvas, like Manjushri. What is Manjushri in Vietnamese? Vantu Sulai Botan. He was not an historical being who became a bodhisattva, as I understand it. He is like an emanation from the Buddha, like a manifestation of the Buddha's wisdom. And that's my understanding of Kwante Ambotat as well, Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara wasn't like a human being necessarily in the past. He's like a ray of sunlight, for example. Avalokiteshvara is like an emanation from the Buddha. So then we have bodhisattvas that are not necessarily separate beings in their own rights, literally separate from the Buddha. So when we're really, as I understand it, this is my view, when we are praying to Kwan Te Ambo Tat, we're really praying to that aspect of the Buddha that is compassion. When we're praying to Manjushri Bodhisattva, we're praying to that aspect of the Buddha that is wisdom, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But you're right, it's difficult to make a really clear distinction because it gets a little fuzzy, exactly what's what. Other questions? Yes?
Is it possible to become bodhicitta being married?
Well, there are differing views on this. The idea really is that monasticism, the life of monks and nuns, is the most conducive, ideally, it is the most conducive to achieving enlightenment. Because the problem is, if we're living a completely normal life, we're interacting with the objects of our attachments all the time, right? Sex and money and entertainment and da-da-da-da-da. So as unenlightened beings, when we're engaging the objects of our attachment, it's very difficult to undo that attachment and the underlying ignorance. That's what the life of a monk or nun is ideally supposed to be about. Now, in the modern world, monks and nuns aren't all up in the mountains or off in the countryside in huts all the time. We live, very busy lives. So the idea is that the monastic life is the most conducive. But that doesn't mean that you cannot practice as a layperson. In fact, it's probably the case that many of us have been monks and nuns in the past, in previous lifetimes, and in this lifetime, none of you are, and I just happen to be. One of my professors once was telling us that as a child, he just naturally gravitated towards practicing Buddhism, and he doesn't practice Tibetan Buddhism now, but his family had some connections with some high Tibetan lamas, and one of them said, he was a monk in a past life, but not one of our monks, not a Tibetan monk. He practiced in a different tradition, but he was a monk in a past life. This life he's married, and he's still practicing. And quite frankly, he knows the Dharma much better than I do, and he's a layperson. So the advice that I give, not that this is necessarily what you're asking, but sometimes people are interested in becoming a monk or a nun because they think they have to, even though they're not really drawn to it. And my advice is, if you are really drawn to a monastic way of life, you should pursue it. If you're not, then don't, because if you force yourself to become a monk or nun and you're not suited to it in this lifetime, it won't be of any benefit. So, but you can definitely practice as a layperson. There's a sutra that I studied for one of my classes. I had to give a presentation on it several years ago. And it was the Buddha's advice to a layperson. And ultimately the Buddha says, he's asking him, well, how can I be happy? And the Buddha says, well, you need to associate with good friends. You should avoid people who encourage you to waste your wealth on, drinking and gambling and things like that. And you need to protect it from thieves and natural disasters and things. And so these are some of the ways that you can be happy in this life. But if you really want happiness, you should practice meditation. So clearly the Buddha wants everyone to practice. Yes?
What is your view of, I don't know if I'm saying that, Mokpo, the third era of the Dharma? It's I think it's called the degenerative era.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, actually in Japan, I don't know what it is in any other language, but in Japanese they call it Mappo.
Yeah.
It means, it's often translated as the age of degenerate Dharma or the latter day of the law. You see different descriptions of it. So, yeah. There are some Buddhist traditions that really believe that at some point in time, the Buddha's teachings lost their power to really save beings. And so all we can do is, for example, the only hope we have is to rely upon the saving grace of Amitabha Buddha. We can no longer become enlightened as human beings, and so the only hope is to, Namo Ida Phap, Namo Ida Phap, Namo Ida Phap, with complete faith. And then Amitabha Buddha will save us. We will be reborn in Amitabha Buddha's Pure Land, and there we will practice, and in the future become enlightened. There's another form of Buddhism from Japan, the Nichiren tradition, which actually focuses on the Lotus Sutra. And they say a similar thing, that Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings no longer have the power to save us, but by chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra and certain sections of the Lotus Sutra, then we can become enlightened. Although they say that it's still possible to become enlightened as a human being, but only through faith in the Lotus Sutra. That's what they say. So, my opinion personally is that doesn't make sense, because what the Buddha taught was simply the truth. And so all we have to do is wake up to that truth. That truth doesn't magically change at some point in history. So all we have to do is wake up to that truth, and then we become enlightened. So in my opinion, there's no magic point in history where Buddha's teachings no longer apply or something. That's like saying, tomorrow gravity could stop. So for me, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, that's a good question though. Thank you. Yes?
I read some kind of story.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's true, but they said when you die, you gotta go to hell, and then before you become another person, you go to some sort that erase your memory, and you become a completely new person.
Mm.
I just wonder why, when we're living as a person right now, why don't we remember about our past, so that we can become a better person? Like, because we can see, in last life we did a lot of bad things.
Mm-hmm.
This life we should become better. Or last life we luckily become a good person, and this life we should cultivate a new one. So why is that?
Well, because of great ignorance, we can't remember. First of all, it isn't that when we die we automatically go to hell. That's not the case. There's this sort of 49-day in-between period between lifetimes. And it's from there that we are born into one of the 6 realms. So either as a hell being, a hungry ghost, an animal, which on this planet would be all the forms of sentient beings that are not human. So that would include insects and birds and all of that too. So an animal, then there are human beings, and then there are what we call the demigods, the Ashura, the fighting gods, sometimes they're called, and then the higher gods. Okay, those are the 6 realms of cyclic existence in which we are born, we grow old, we die, and are reborn again. But so first there's this 49-day period in between that isn't one of those 6 realms, okay? And then we are reborn. Now, in fact, there are lots of stories from all over the world of children around the age of 3-4 years old suddenly starting to talk about their previous lives. So sometimes children, in fact, do have at least some memory of their previous lifetimes. In fact, when I was a little boy, when I was about 4 years old, my mother, she didn't tell me this until I was in high school or college maybe, and by then, unfortunately, she had forgotten the details, but she said she was making dinner in our apartment, and that I was sitting at the table waiting for dinner, and I just started to talk about my past life as a truck driver. So apparently, in my last life, I was not a monk, I was a truck driver. And at first she was like, honey, that's nice, she's making mashed potatoes or whatever, She's like, yeah, whatever. But then I started to give her more and more detail until she stopped cooking and she turned around and just looked at me like, she said her mouth was open, and she just sat and listened to me for a while. Because my family is nominally Protestant Christian, right? I was never baptized, but we went to Sunday school as kids and everything. So this wasn't part of what my parents grew up with. So I'm giving her all this detail, and finally I said, and then I died in a crash. So I said in my last life, the only thing she could remember when she told me this story was that in my last life I was a truck driver and that I died in a crash. So little children, the point is that little children sometimes do remember. Interestingly, to this day, I like to drive, especially long drives on the highway. I like to drive, but I hate driving near trucks. It freaks me out. And I never knew why, and then my mother told me this just a moment. So, but in a sense, because everything that we say and do, it imprints upon our mind. So whatever wisdom and compassion we accumulate from the previous life, whatever habits that we create in the previous life, in a general sense, that does continue in the next life. But at some point, as we grow older and we settle into this life, we're sort of cut off from those memories from the past, but that's because of our ignorance. Buddhas actually can see not only all of their own previous lifetimes, but all of ours as well. So enlightened beings can see that. Yes, I'm sorry, you had your hand up?
There's actually a book about this 2-year-old boy,
Mm-hmm.
and he barely learned how to talk, and it's nonfiction. So, and he remembered not most, like some of his past life, and he would just tell like his, parents about incidents where he was in World War II and in full sentences and very detailed.
Mm.
And after he wakes up, or after he regains his conscious or something, then he can't talk anymore.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
There was a documentary I saw of a little boy, well, a part of it was about a little boy in India, and this is just from the 1990s maybe, who started talking about his old home. And he said, I have to go back to my home. And his parents were saying, your home is right here. And he says, no, my other home. And finally, he started giving more detail about his family and everything, and he was able to give names and an address. And so they went there, and in fact, not long before that boy was born, there had been a son in that household who had died. And he's like, oh, I recognize this, and this used to be mine, and that used to be mine. Of course, in India, belief in rebirth is much more common. So there are lots of stories out there about it. Yeah. Yes. Did I answer your question fully, do you think? Okay, thank you. I went on for a while. Yes, last question.
About what she told you, does that mean first there was a firstborn, then the firstborn died, and then there's a new one?
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly like a 5-year rule, it's mostly like the same as like if they never found out about it until that person grew up, and then he met, and then this mysterious figure came and met him, saying that he knows him and all that stuff.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite understand. But what we're talking about is someone who, there was a person in the past who died, and then sometime after that, a new child is born.
It's almost like this. First it died, and then suddenly somebody tried to bring that child back from the dead.
No, it doesn't work like that. Our karma, the causes that we create, pull us into our new life. So no one is trying to bring us or put us into a new life. It's just our own karma pulls us into each life. That's how it works. Excuse me, let me double check the time here. Yes. I'm sorry, we do need to stop there, but we will begin the meditation part now, so thank you very much.